Good afternoon. Nice to see you all. I hope you're staying safe and well. Welcome back the penultimate chapter, chapter 9 of Animal Farm is our focus in today's video tutorial. I always think chapter 9 is probably the most um, memorable chapter of them all in terms of the events that take place and the amount of pathos and sympathy that the reader feels for the characters, particularly, of course, the great boxer as he is carted away to the knackers, which I'm sure you've read already. We'll be looking at allegory, symbolism, and irony in that order in today's lesson, and then I'll also kind of drop in aspects of narrative structure because I think it's important to talk about how Orwell is starting to craft this story towards its resolution in chapter 10. So we'll start by looking at a summary, then we'll go through the allegory and the symbolism that's used. I think I want to spend particular time on the symbolism in today's lesson, and irony is being used by Orwell throughout this chapter because we're coming towards as I said, the ending, the resolution of the narrative. So just a couple of reminders for me. Really important that you've read the chapter already, that you've passed the quiz on the chapter before taking part in today's video tutorial, and you've completed the review quizzes as well. So let's make a start by having a look at the chapter summary. Okay, here's your summary. You won't hear my voice again for a minute or so whilst you have time to read. So chapter 9 begins with a description of the split hoof that Boxer on the left has suffered as a result of essentially exerting himself too much and working too hard to try and build and repair the windmill. And Boxer, we've talked about in previous lessons, is an allegory for the working class, particularly the proletariat, who were the engine room, I suppose, of the Soviet Union, the ones who were uh, charged with industrializing Russia and modernizing it at a rapid rate. And the fact that he is exhausted, I suppose, allegorically represents the exhaustion of the proletariat in the Soviet Union and essentially how they were exploited by Stalinism and Stalin's pursuit of rapid progress and rapid technological advancement. And it's interesting how he frames. I said I'd drop in comments about the narrative structure. It's interesting how this chapter is framed. It's framed with essentially this foreboding use of foreshadowing. Really, the fact that his split hoof is taking a long time to heal really does linger in our memories as we read this chapter. And of course, the ending, that awful ending when he's taken away to the knackers because his injuries have failed to heal, is particularly powerful because Orwell hints at it from the very beginning in this use of foreshadowing. And it's ultimately we'll talk about this in more detail later on, but the split hoof that he's suffered is really symbolic of the sacrifice that the proletariat in Russia made in the advancement of Russian technology and Russian industry, and essentially the wounds that he's suffered represent the agony of that class of people in Russia. So that's how the chapter is framed, and of course we'll go on in more detail. We'll talk about this in more detail later in the lesson when we discuss the event, which is the kind of the crucial event or the climactic event of the chapter, which is Boxer being taken away in the knacker's van. Another significant allegory that's used, I would suppose, as a framing device in the narrative is again the use of pathetic fallacy, and particularly the reference to the winters and the cold winters and how the winters are getting colder each year. This, I suppose, is allegorical in the sense that it represents the hardship that the Russian people experienced under Stalin and how life under Stalin grew progressively worse each year for the Russian people. And what happens in this chapter is there's a clearly, and it's happened in previous chapters as well, is the association between winter and food shortages and the idea that the animals are slowly starving. To go back to this idea of narrative structure, if we think back to chapter 1, how the animals were underfed under Farmer Jones, and now there's a cyclical pattern here, as in the farm is returning full circle to how it was, or what it was like under Farmer Jones, in the sense that the animals are now malnourished, that they're overworked, their lives are particularly hard. They are, they're suffering, and I think that's really, really important in ultimately understanding the moral fable, which we talked about in previous lessons. What is the moral message of this fable? And we'll discuss that in a lot more detail in the next lesson. But think about why Orwell is framing the chapter with pathetic fallacy, why he's using references to winter and food shortages. It's clearly an allegory of what was taking place in Russia under Stalin. Okay, next I'd like to talk about Orwell's use of allegory and symbolism in his description of the pigs, and essentially it links to the new hierarchy that has been created on Animal Farm, which I'll go on to talk about. I think what's interesting about the use of symbolism is it's quite subtle, but I'm sure some of us would have picked up on it. Firstly, there's this idea that the young pigs who've been, who have been fathered by Napoleon, which is kind of again a hint at the corruption of Napoleon and the leadership of Animal Farm. That he's, he's bred 31 pigs. He's the only one allowed to mate. It's a symbol of inequality, I suppose. But what I want to focus on is the raising of the young pigs. So the children or the piglets that Napoleon fathers, they are separated and segregated from the other animals. I don't know if you noticed that or not. I'll read the sentence, the part I'm talking about out, which is on page 82. They took their exercise in the garden, were discouraged from playing with the other young animals. About this time too it was laid down as a rule that when a pig and any other animal met on the path, the other animal must stand aside, and also that all pigs, of whatever degree, were to have the privilege of wearing green ribbons on their tails on Sundays. And there's so much symbolism in this description. Firstly, this idea of segregation. That means the idea of separating and not having any mingling, I suppose, or mixing between different classes. And here it's clear that symbolically the pigs are now the superior class, or that they are the ones who are who are higher up in the hierarchy of Animal Farm. They're essentially the leadership. And it's symbolically important that they no longer allow their children to mix with other animals. So clearly there's this implicit idea that they view their own children as being special and as being superior to the other animals. And clearly it goes without saying really that this goes against the principles of animalism that were set out by Old Major, the idea that all animals were equal. This is clearly not equal. This is clearly a symbolic of the inequality between the pigs and other animals. So that's the first example, that the young pigs are segregated from the other animals. It's kept separate from the other animals. Then we have another example on that same paragraph, the idea that when a pig meets another animal on a path, the other animal has to stand aside. And again, symbolically, that represents inequality, doesn't it? It represents that the other animals have to be what we call subservient to, which means they have to act as though they are inferior to the pigs. So again, we have a second symbol here for inequality. And clearly, the ideals of animalism, of creating an equal, classless society of animals, that's clearly been portrayed by the pigs, because the pigs are clearly presenting themselves as being superior. And the last and probably the most, I would suppose, sinister of the symbols is the green ribbons, which I'll discuss now. So just if you can recall, earlier on in the novel, in the earlier chapters, the ribbons are one of the symbols of slavery and oppression that are thrown onto the bonfire that the animals build in celebration of expelling Farmer Jones. So initially, these ribbons are seen as badges of slavery. That's what Squealer or Snowball says when Molly refuses to give up her ribbons. He says, "Throw it in the fire. This is a badge of slavery." So that's what the ribbons used to represent. They used to represent the idea that man used to be essentially the master and the animals were the slaves, and they were the ribbons were a badge of that slavery. However, now these green ribbons are worn by the pigs, and of course the symbolism now the meaning behind the symbolism has changed and altered, but it's become incredibly sinister because of course one of the crucial messages sent to the animals, or one of the crucial messages of Old Major's speech, was that the animals should avoid acting like humans and avoid taking up their vices. And clearly the pigs are acting more and more in a human-like way. So there's firstly, this is a kind of an example of symbolism and foreshadowing, because the ribbons are clearly symbolic, but it also foreshadows, which means it hints to the reader that the pigs are going to act increasingly human in an increasingly human-like way. They're already killing other animals, they're already wearing badges, they're already trading, they're already drinking, so they're already taking up a lot of the human vices, a lot of the sins associated with humanity, and the ribbons become the latest sin, I suppose. And of course, on an allegorical level, the fact that the pigs wear ribbons is an allegory for how the Russian Communist Party essentially became increasingly corrupt, betrayed its own values, and started to act in a way that was very similar to the leadership under the Tsar. So that's the allegory behind this. It's the fact that the communist state, and particularly Stalin himself, start to become very much like the hierarchy that they overthrew in the revolution. They become very much like Tsar Nicholas II and his family. Another important symbol of the corruption of Animal Farm that I'm going to talk about briefly, in terms of and talk about the allegory as well, is the return of Moses the Raven, who was of course Farmer Jones's favourite pet, and we talked about how he's an allegory for the Russian Orthodox Church and how the church essentially benefited and profited from their association with the royal family in Russia. And the fact that he's returned is important because it represents the idea that, again, we talked about the narrative structure of Animal Farm, how the farm is returning full circle to what it was like when it was Manor Farm. So essentially what's happening is the whole purpose of the rebellion and the whole point of the revolution was to construct a utopian society, and the novel is slowly, kind of in a circular way, returning to the dystopia that it was at the beginning. So all of the efforts of the animals, in a sense, are being undone, and that's what Moses the Raven's return represents on an allegorical level. Another important symbol that we have discussed in previous lessons is the pasture that was supposed to be kept fallow, which means supposed to be kept untended, so they're basically just as a field of grass for retired animals. And Boxer and Benjamin have spent their entire careers on Animal Farm looking forward to retirement. So this pasture is a symbol of hope, a symbol of almost the utopian vision of what Animal Farm should be like, and it offers them it now becomes a symbol of false hope, because the pigs have no intention of allowing any animal to retire, and of course that's represented in what happens to Boxer. So the meaning behind the symbolism here has altered, it's changed. It used to be a symbol of hope and a symbol of kind of gratitude to the workers, and now it's become a symbol of betrayal and a symbol of false hope. And finally, most importantly, the most important event symbolically in the chapter is, of course, the betrayal of Boxer, who is told that he's going to a vet in Willingdon, but is actually being taken to the knackers, where he'll be boiled down and turned into glue, bone meal. So it's a really traumatic and heart-wrenching scene as the animals wave goodbye to him, not realizing where he's actually going. And this is an important event in the novel. Of course, rightfully so, Boxer is one of our favourite characters because he represents all of these positive characteristics. He's hardworking, he's honest, he's virtuous, he's selfless. He puts himself before he puts others before himself. He's dedicated. All of these, essentially, to boil it down to one word, Boxer is a virtuous character, and we as readers empathise and sympathise with Boxer throughout the novel because of his honesty, because of his virtuous nature, and the fact that he's put in more work than any other animal in transforming manor farm into animal farm and transforming animal farm from being a backwards farm to being an advanced farm, the fact that he is the one who is betrayed is hugely significant symbolically. It represents the betrayal of the animals and the most awful betrayal of the animals, because if any animal should have been rewarded with retirement, of course it should have been Boxer. And the fact that the pigs are prepared to betray him, and let's remind ourselves that the reason they betray him is one of financial gain. They betray him so that they can afford, with the money they get from him, they can afford to buy a crate of whiskey. So the betrayal of Boxer is the ultimate act of betrayal and corruption. It's so morally wrong, and it's almost the event that breaks other animals. They're clearly not convinced by Squealer when he tries to persuade them that Boxer actually died peacefully in hospital. Let's move on to the allegory of this. What does it represent allegorically? We've talked a lot throughout these lecture series about how Boxer represents the proletariat, the working class in the urban environments, the industrial working class. Think about the communist flag. It's the hammer and the sickle. The proletariat is depicted in the symbol of the hammer, and Boxer represents this proletariat class in Russia who were responsible for transforming Russia and modernizing Russia into in an incredibly rapid way. Remember those 5-year plans, and the fact that he's been betrayed is, of course, allegorically representative of the betrayal of the working classes in Russia, and this is huge. Let's just remind ourselves of Mr. Karl Marx. So just a reminder of Karl Marx, the founder, the philosophical founder of communism, and remember the maxim of communism in the Communist Manifesto, and that very bold declaration at the beginning of the Communist Manifesto, which is "Workers of the world, unite! You have nothing to lose but your chains." So essentially, the whole point of communism was to allow the working classes to overthrow their masters and form a class of society where the workers owned the labor, the workers owned what we call the means of production. That's the whole point of communism, to create a classless equal society where the workers are the ones in charge. And of course, the fact that Boxer is the one that's betrayed represents allegorically the betrayal of the working classes in Russia, because they were promised by Marx and by Lenin, they were promised a society in which the workers were in control of the means of production. The workers were the state. The workers were the government. And of course, what's happened on Animal Farm, and likewise what happened in Russia, is that revolution was betrayed by Joseph Stalin and his allies. Joseph Stalin took the principle of communism and corrupted it. And of course, we do not have, you cannot call Stalin's Russia a truly communist country, because of course it wasn't an equal society. It wasn't a society run by the workers. So to be crystal clear, the portrayal of Boxer is an allegory for the betrayal of the Russian working classes, who were supposed to be the beneficiaries. They were supposed to have benefited from the revolution, but of course they actually suffered even more than they had suffered under Tsar Nicholas II. Okay, the final symbol that links to the allegory I'd like to discuss is the crate of whiskey delivered to the pigs at the end of the chapter. And think about the framing in that narrative structure. The chapter opens with a description of Boxer's split hoof, and it ends in what that split hoof was exchanged for, which is the crates of whiskey. So it's a clever way of framing the chapter from Orwell. And of course, the whiskey represents the corruption of the leadership of Animal Farm and the corruption of the pigs. And simply on an allegorical level, it represents the corruption of the Bolshevik leadership and the Bolsheviks. It represents the corruption of Stalin and the leadership of Stalinist Russia, and it represents the growing inequality between the leadership of the country and its people. So by the end of the chapter, and I think this really is appropriate from chapter 7 or 8 onwards, really, this is what Animal Farm looks like in terms of the hierarchy. And I'll give you a moment to have a think about that and have a look. And the subtext really, and by subtext I mean the hidden story, the story below the story. Sub always means below, so think about subterranean, subway, it's a passage below, right? So the subtext, the story below the real story, is that one hierarchy, and I'll show you the hierarchy I mean, has been replaced by another hierarchy. Look at how rigid this hierarchy is. Look at how there are lots of people at the bottom and very few people at the top. It's a very unequal society. It's a dictatorship, isn't it? But there is a hierarchy to Animal Farm that has essentially replaced the hierarchy of Manor Farm, and I'll remind you of that hierarchy. So this is the hierarchy of the feudal Russia, which is of course what Manor Farm was an allegory of. So it represents the hierarchy of life under Farmer Jones. And essentially what's happened in the novel and the subtext of the novel is that one hierarchy that was very unequal and very oppressive has been replaced by a very similar hierarchy, which is actually even worse, even more oppressive, and even more violent and fearful. Okay, so your checkpoint is on the screen in front of you. Please, as always, follow my suggested timings and make sure you write in full sentences as well, because of course you're submitting your notes to me. And I'll see you shortly. Welcome back. That marks the end of part 1 of this video tutorial. In part 2, which will be a shorter episode, we'll be looking at the use of irony throughout this chapter. So we've looked at allegory and symbolism. Next lesson we'll be looking at Orwell's use of irony. Stay safe, stay well, and I'll see you next time for part 2. Goodbye.